Can you guys hear me? Yes. Hello, everyone. So my name is Cecilia Moon. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy. And thank you all for joining us here at Michael Cholbi's talk on grief and resilience. Apologies for the little technical difficulty. Today, what we're going to have is Solana over here is going to be our MC. She's our student MC. And Solana, if you want to go ahead and
Hey guys, here I'm gonna come over so that Michael can see me. Hey, I'm Solana. I'm a philosophy and psychology student at North Park, and I am a freshman. So I'm waiting this just like the rest of you all are. But I'm very excited. Michael, thank you for coming in. We read his paper in class for philosophy of emotion, which wants to be our philosophy of emotion students. So we had the opportunity to work with your essay and break it down, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say about it. So I'm just going to give you a brief introduction. Michael Cholbi is professor of philosophy. He's the chair of the Department of Philosophy at University of Edinburgh in Scotland. He is also the author of Grief, a Philosophical Guide, Understanding Kant's Ethics, and Suicide, the Philosophical Dimensions. He is a founding member of the International Association for the Philosophy of Death and Dying and serves on the editorial board of several prestigious philosophy journals. Michael, thank you so much for coming in. If you want to go ahead and just start, that would be great. We'd love to hear it. Yes.
Well, great. Thanks for the introduction. First, let me take care of the technology. So let me go ahead and set up the sharing here.
Yeah, just one note that not everybody here has read your paper. A lot of students have, but not all of us have.
I was definitely not assuming that you had, so.
Okay, perfect.
All right. Let me just get these slides up for you. All right, are those visible for folks? Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So this is a talk about grief and resilience, as its title says. I thought that I might start by just giving a bit of a sense of what it is that a philosopher like myself is interested in when we turn our eyes toward a phenomenon like grief. So since, well, about a decade ago, the mid-2010s, I have been interested in philosophical questions surrounding grief. Many of my ideas are collected in the book that was mentioned in the introduction, Grief, a Philosophical Guide. But to give you a sense of the kinds of things that I'm interested in, one question, I suppose, is just what grief is, what's the nature of grief? I'm also interested in questions about the value of grief, what sort of importance should it have for us? I'm interested in the question of grief's moral significance. For example, is there a duty to grieve? I'm also interested in the question of whether grief will or is ever a rational response to loss. That will actually be very prominent in our conversation today. The question of whether we should ever think that grief is pathological, that we're ever sick with grief, that it could ever count as an instance of mental illness or mental disorder. And then finally, what should our overall attitude toward grief be? Now, a lot of my work turns out to be motivated by a kind of opposition, actually, to a kind of antipathy toward grief that you see throughout the history of philosophy. In defending grief, which much of my work does defend grief, I am in many respects swimming against the historical philosophical tide. Let me give you a few examples of that tide against which I am swimming. So some of you, particularly the philosophy students there, may well have read Socrates, rather Plato's dialogue, the Phaedo. And you may remember that in the Phaedo, we are witness to the death of Socrates, or the moments leading up to the death of Socrates. And in this dialogue, Socrates has his friends and students gathered around him. And at a moment where he's beginning to prepare to drink the poison hemlock that will end his life, he notices that those surrounding him are giving evidence of grief, crying and so forth. And in a moment that I find somewhat unsettling, he actually rebukes his friends and students for their grief. He says to them that they're only grieving because they believe mistakenly that his death will be a harm to him. You may remember that Socrates believed that he will survive his death, that his soul is immortal. And he denounces his students and friends for their grieving, calling it childish and womanly, depicting it as weak. Another sort of example of this antipathy toward grief in the history of philosophy comes from the Stoic philosopher Seneca. So Seneca wrote much of his philosophy in the form of letters to correspondents of various kinds. And in one of his letters, a correspondent named Lucilius is asking for advice about how to deal with grief. And Seneca's main advice to Lucilius, rather, is that he should, in effect, stop blubbering. He should look for a new friend. His friend had died, just in the same way that it would make sense for you to get a new cloak if you had lost your cloak. Seneca, in effect, says to him, surely it's ridiculous for you to be sad about losing your friend any more than it would be sad to have lost your cloak if, in fact, you can get another one. And I think this is a reflection of the Stoic stance on grief, which tended to think that grief was a kind of self-indulgent or self-pitying phenomenon where we sort of wallow in our own sorrow. And it's also an indication of something that, from the Stoic perspective, is unfortunate. The Stoics believed that we should strive for a life of virtue, where a virtuous life is a life where we are, in effect, dependent for our own thriving only on ourselves. We're not dependent on resources outside of ourselves. And so the grieving person, from the Stoic perspective, is giving evidence that they have become or were already excessively dependent for their thriving on the presence of others. Let me give just one more example of philosophical antipathy toward grief. So the Chinese Taoist philosopher Zhuangzi reports, or is reported about him, that he came upon a man who was grieving for the death of his wife. He was banging upon a drum in a traditional, singing a traditional Chinese song of mourning. And Zhuangzi reports that the master upbraids this man for his grief, telling him that his grief rests on the false belief that that things can survive, when in fact, if we look around the world, everything is ephemeral, nothing is eternal, all is cyclical. And so in grieving, what you're in effect doing is trying foolishly to deny destiny. So those are three examples of philosophical antipathy toward grief. And I think that though not all philosophers have been hostile toward grief, it's pretty uncommon within the traditions to think that grief is in some way not a very positive reflection upon us. Now, there's a way in which I think that this antipathy toward grief is, not obviously incorrect. So what I'm showing you here on the slide is a ranking of different life events based on the characteristic stress that they undergo. This was developed by a pair of researchers in the 1960s and 70s, Holmes and Rahi. And the way Holmes and Rahi investigated the degree of stress that different life events present to us is they, in effect, said, let's just figure out which one of these events is the most stressful, assign that as 100, and then index all of the other stressful events relative to that. Now, if you look at the ranking of life stress events that Holmes and Rahi developed, you'll see that at the very top is the death of one's spouse, and it's assigned the value of 100. You'll note that the next item down on the list is divorce, which there's a big gap, right, between divorce and death of a spouse, 73 versus 100, which suggests that the death of one's spouse is a much more stressful event than even divorcing one's spouse. And you'll notice that further down the list are other grief-related events, the death of a close family member coming in at number 5, and then the death of a close friend down at the bottom at number 17. But I take it this as something important and captures something that I imagine a lot of us intuitively accept, which is that on its face, there's not a lot to recommend grief. It's a difficult and stressful experience for many people. There's something about it that most people find emotionally vexatious. Now, despite the fact that there is something to be said for this hostility or antipathy toward grief, these philosophers, right, who present grief as weak or irrational or something to be avoided or minimized, well, I don't share their view. I disagree with this position. I think we should actually think that grief is, or at least can be, a good-making feature of human life. And what I want to do today with a little help there from my friend Michael Douglas from the 1980s film Wall Street, is I want to defend grief against a pair of related problems that philosophers have raised, that each of these problems are oriented around what we might call resilience. So here's the rough agenda for the remainder of the conversation. First, I'm going to introduce what I'm going to call the problem of resilience, the resilience problem, and I'm going to provide you with two different versions of the problem that philosophers have articulated. Secondly, I'm then going to say a bit about my own theory of the nature of grief, since this will help us understand how I think the resilience problem is best addressed. Third, I'll then try to show you that my theory answers each version of this problem, shows that the problem is not really a problem, or we shouldn't think it's quite so problematic. Then I'll have some brief remarks at the end, perhaps about what grief can tell us about the phenomenon of resilience. So what is this problem of resilience, at least this problem of resilience in the philosophy of grief literature? Well, here it is in a kind of nutshell. So when we look at evidence from psychology and other disciplines of that kind that investigate grief experience, what this literature seems to have discovered is that people recover from the grief that they undergo in response to the deaths of those that matter to them. And they recover pretty quickly. Negative emotions and affect end pretty quickly. And we return to our prior levels of happiness and well-being relatively quickly as well. We show a kind of resilience, then we might say, in the face of grief. But what some philosophers have argued is that this resilience should strike us not as an entirely happy thing. There is something disconcerting or worrying about this kind of resilience. Well, what's worrying about it? Well, what these philosophers think is that this resilience shows that our grieving doesn't really take full stock of the reasons that we have for grieving in the first place, that somehow our grieving responses don't reflect the nature or the magnitude of the very reasons that we have for grief at all. So there's a way in which, according to these philosophers at least, our typical grief reactions turn out to be irrational in a way that should strike us as unsettling or even disturbing. So here's the first version of this resilience problem, the problem of resilience. So I'm going to call this first version ends too soon. So the first version begins from, again, that observation that we don't grieve as long as we expect to, not as long as most of us would predict. So one widely cited study was conducted by a group of researchers in Canada who studied the spouses of those who were in hospice. And as you know, when someone is in hospice, this is because they're anticipating that they will be dying soon. And what these researchers did is they asked these spouses of those who are in hospice to estimate how long they think they would be grieving. And what the spouses said, their median estimate for how long they'd be grieving was between 1 and 2 years. And then what the researchers did is they actually followed up with those same subjects and asked them how long their grief actually occurred, for how long it actually occurred. And the median was between 4 and 6 months. And so this is an illustration of a finding that seems to be pretty widely replicated, which is that we recover from grief pretty quickly. We recover in such a way that we return to our pre-grief levels of well-being pretty quickly. Most people seem within about half a year's time to feel just as positively about life before the death of this important person in their life as they do afterward. And nearly all of the most intense feelings surrounding grief, the intense affect surrounding grief, abates after about 8 weeks, 2 months. And maybe even most surprising, a small but significant percentage of bereaved people, in effect, say that bereavement meant, for them at least, that their sense of well-being increased, that they were happier than they were previously, but prior to the death of the person whose death they are grieving. Okay. So this is a kind of summation of the literature to which I'm referring here from an article from the 1990s. But just to read out here, sometimes the majority of bereaved individuals exhibit only short-lived grief reactions and a relatively rapid return to baseline functioning. Bereavement theorists have tended to assume that the normative responses to loss involve either chronic suffering or gradual recovery lasting at least several years. The relative absence of distress during bereavement is thought to be rare and psychopathological. So in other words, most bereavement theorists had thought up until, say, the late 1990s that grief takes, a few years to resolve itself. But in fact, right, the evidence suggests that it resolves itself much more quickly and thoroughly than that. As the article continues, recent research has provided a strong challenge to these views. The relative absence of grief symptoms and the continued ability to function adequately following the death of a close relation do not appear to reflect denial or pathology, but rather an inherent and adaptive resilience in the face of loss. So notice the suggestion here is that we might expect, right, that certain very profound, deep losses that people suffer will lead them to grieve for many, many years. No doubt a few people are like this, but that's exceptional. And as these researchers suggest, we should view this as a kind of adaptive response, or some way in which by grieving with the kind of brevity that we do, this allows us to, well, kind of move on with life without too much difficulty. Here, Dan Moeller, in an article that got philosophers interested in this in 2007, again, empirical research seems to show that most people manifest resilience in the face of loss. They're initially traumatized, but they quickly recover and manifest little long-term distress. Okay? So there's a sense in which, perhaps against our expectations or against our folk wisdom, we seem to recover, if you will, exhibit a kind of resilience through grief that's perhaps unexpected in light of the depth of the losses that we seem to undergo. And what Moeller says is that we should think that this resilience or adaptiveness to loss says something disheartening, worrying. What does it say? Well, he says that we have apparently a kind of emotional immune system that doesn't react in ways that seem to reflect the importance of those who die. We would expect, after all, that our grief responses are going to track, right, reflect the importance of those whom we've lost. And if this evidence is to believe, Moeller thinks, in fact, our grief responses don't seem to track the depth or magnitude of these losses. So on the one hand, from what we might call the survivor perspective, the bereaved person's perspective, my resilience, the fact that I seem to return to the life that I had, the status quo before the death of the person in question, might seem to suggest to me that my loved one didn't matter as much as they seemed to. I thought that I might grieve for years and years upon the death of my wife or my father or something like that. But perhaps what that says is our relationships don't matter to us as much as we anticipate. And then from the perspective of, if you will, the dead, the resilience that grieved people show might suggest that you, the dead person, didn't, or while you're alive, did not matter as much as they seemed to. So the thought that seems to reside behind Moeller's analysis is that this kind of resilience, this adaptiveness, is counter-evidence to the importance that we assign to our closest personal relationships. Again, we would expect to grieve with greater intensity or for a longer duration than we in fact do. And so this says something, again, unsettling or worrying about the actual importance of our personal relationships. So that was version 1, the ends too soon version. But here's version 2 of the problem of resilience. This is mostly due to Barry Marusic, who incidentally has the office next to mine here at the University of Edinburgh. But Marusic asks in his book on the temporality of emotions, what principles apply to when or for how long we ought to undergo an emotion, right? This is a question about the temporal duration of emotion. And roughly, I'm paraphrasing his response, but roughly what Marusic says is that we should undergo an emotion so long as the facts that justify that emotion hold true, so long as those facts are in place. So here are a few examples to illustrate or corroborate Marusic's claim. So I should be afraid of a windstorm that is forecast as long as that storm hasn't yet occurred, right? It doesn't seem to be rational to be afraid of some event once it has occurred or once the event is in the past. Okay. I should be excited about Christmas, right, coming as long as Christmas is approaching, but not once it arrives. Okay. And I should be anxious about taking a driving test before it's occurred or while it's happening, but not afterward. So these are all examples that seem to support Marusic's claim or thesis that we should undergo an emotion so long as the facts that seem to justify or holding the emotion hold true. So it doesn't make sense to be afraid, right, of some event that has already occurred. It doesn't make sense to be excited about something that has already arrived. It doesn't make sense to be anxious about something after it's occurred, and so on. Now, what's interesting, or at least what's relevant for us here, is that there are, according to Marusic, some emotions for which the facts that justify them hold true forever. That is, once those facts obtain, they always obtain. And as a consequence of this, we should in effect always feel the emotion at issue. So here would be some examples that fit into this pattern. So I should regret not helping my sister after the difficult birth of her son at every time after I failed to help. Why is that? Well, it's true forever that I failed to help. And as a consequence of this, I ought always to regret this. I ought always to regret it at every point after which I failed to provide her that help. In a similar way, I should be disappointed that my essay didn't win the senior prize when I was an undergraduate, at every time after which it was true that I didn't win. I should still be regretting it now if this reasoning is sound. After all, it's still true that I didn't win the prize, and the facts that make the emotion rational for me to hold still hold true. And so we should infer from this that it's rational for these emotions never to end, or even never really to diminish. After all, the reasons that we have for having the emotions in the first place haven't changed. But what Marusic says that's quite germane to our conversation is that grief is among the emotions that fall into this forever category, that rationally speaking, we should never stop grieving. After all, it's true that if someone close to you dies, you've suffered this loss. And that fact still holds as true today as it does, last week, last year, last decade. A loved one's death is always and forever a loss, and so you ought to experience it as such. So notice that both versions of the resilience problem are in effect saying to us that our characteristic or typical resilient grief reactions are in some way irrational, a way that's worrying to, or should be worrying to us. We don't grieve as long as we should. Either we should grieve longer than we do, or we should in fact grieve forever. All right. Now, the resilience problem is a problem that I think rests on some false assumptions about the nature of grief. Probably rests on some false assumptions, I should say, about the nature of resilience too, though that won't be quite so much of a focus for me. So what are those false assumptions? Well, I think there are 4 such assumptions. The first assumption is to think that grief is a kind of simple emotion. It identifies grief more or less with sadness or sorrow. I'm going to argue that, in fact, we should think that grief is not a single emotion, but in fact involves quite a lot of emotions. And in fact, the heart of grief, the way to think about it as a kind of psychological phenomenon, is to think that grief is a kind of state of attention to something or someone that we've lost. A second assumption that I think is being made by those who propound this problem is that grief is rational when and because this particular emotion, again, sadness or sorrow, is rational. I'm going to argue rather that the way to think about the rationality of grief is in terms of whether the intention involved in grief is rational. I think that those who are putting forth this problem assume, thirdly, that grief should end when the facts that make this emotion rational have ended. I, in fact, think that it should end when it no longer benefits us to direct attention to the loss, when it no longer makes sense for us to direct our cognitive resources at it. And finally, fourthly, the proponents of this problem think that grief is significant just insofar as it's a response to the loss. They think of grief's significance primarily in terms of backward-looking considerations, the fact that we have lost someone who matters to us. But I'm going to argue that it's also significant because it allows us to develop a revised sense of our identity. And so it's significant not merely because of how we respond to loss through grief, but also it allows us to develop a sense of identity going forward in life, that is, it has a kind of future orientation as well. So the upshot of all of this is, or will be, that the fact that we seem to be resilient in grief is really not unsettling, or it shouldn't suggest to us that our grief tends not to capture the importance of those we've lost or the significance of our relationship with them. So let me go ahead now and outline my case for those 4 claims that I've just provided to you. So a first important observation here is that grief very often, of course, will include sorrow or sadness. I suppose that's the kind of affective state or the emotion that's most closely associated with grieving. But most every grief episode will also include some other emotions. In the course of grieving, people don't only feel sadness or sorrow. They'll also feel emotions like anger or resentment. Sometimes they'll feel guilty. Sometimes they'll feel worried or anxious. Sometimes they feel what we might call positive emotions. They might feel a sense of relief. They might feel a sense of joyfulness. They might feel a sense of gratitude. So to the extent that grief is an emotional phenomenon, and I do agree it is a highly emotional phenomenon, it doesn't seem to be one that is exhausted by just this one emotion, sadness or sorrow. It seems very often to contain many other different emotions as well. One way to think about what's going on then in the course of grief is that we are experiencing when we're grieving what I've called in one of my papers an emotional data dump. Roughly what's going on, I think, in grieving is that when we experience these different emotions, we're being told things by our psyche, given some evidence by our psyche about our relationship with the deceased. So, for example, if in the course of grieving someone's death, you feel anger or resentment, that's probably evidence that there was some way in which you believe that you were treated unfairly by this person. And hence you have anger toward them and you have a conflict with them that has gone unresolved. If, for example, you were to experience guilt in the course of your grieving, that would suggest rather that you believe that you treated the deceased unfairly. And there we have a kind of unresolved conflict as well. If it's worry or anxiety, that would suggest that you were attached to the deceased individual, and so their absence from your life is unsettling. If you feel relief, then perhaps it turns out that, surprisingly to you perhaps, the deceased was in some way a burden to you. And so feeling relief is an indication of the burden in question being alleviated. But again, the underlying thought here is that we shouldn't be too surprised that grief contains all of these emotions, because it's a process wherein we're trying to make sense of a loss. And in many ways, the people that we lose to death, our relationships with them are complicated, right? We don't just have one sort of emotion toward those who died. We often have many different emotions that reflect different aspects of our relationships with them. So there's quite a lot of emotions, I think, that can be found in different grief episodes, but it's also worth keeping in mind that we shouldn't think that grief is just a collection or a sequence of emotions or feelings. People do lots of other things in the course of grief. What sorts of things? Well, one thing that people do is they try to gather their memories of the deceased. They try to come to some sort of picture, right, or understanding of the deceased through memory. They will, in the course of grieving, make certain choices, right, related to the fact of this person's death. So, for example, one choice that bereaved people face are decisions about what to do with the deceased's belongings. Another sort of thing that we do in the course of grieving is we often curate the deceased person's legacy, right? We try to ensure that they will be remembered by others, that their accomplishments are taken stock of. We also undergo grief in our bodies. It's not solely a mental or psychological phenomena. There are many bodily changes that are traceable to grief, things like loss of appetite, insomnia, and the like. And of course, we don't just do any of these things or all of these things by ourselves. Sometimes we do all of these things or any of these things with others. Sometimes grief is shared, or we engage in the kinds of ritual practices that are associated with mourning. And that, I think, puts on the table a really important question. What unites all of this, right? What is it that entitles us to say that all of this is part of some coherent episode, some sort of coherent experience we call grief? How can we make sense of each of these as components, right, of grief? Well, my suggestion is that we should think of grief not as an emotion, despite the fact that it's chock full of emotion, but as an active state of attention to the deceased and our relationship with them. The American philosopher William James, I think, gave the classic expression of what it is that we're talking about when we're talking about attention. So James, in an essay written in the late 19th century, said that attention is the taking possession by the mind in clear and vivid form of one of what seem several simultaneously possible objects or trains of thought. It implies withdrawal from some things in order to deal effectively with others, and is a condition which has a real opposite in the confused, dazed, or scatterbrained state. Okay? I take it that James is successful here in kind of unpacking, right, our pre-theoretical, ordinary way of thinking about what attention is. To be in a state of attention is to direct your cognitive focus at one event or one set of concerns at the expense of others, right? You focus your attention on some set of phenomena, some set of concerns, while, as he says, you're withdrawing from other things. So if you happen to have, let's say, a big exam coming up in one of your courses, perhaps that's absorbing your attention. What that means is that that exam and the prospect of taking the exam is foremost in your mind, and other sorts of things that might be possible objects of your mental focus recede to the periphery, so to speak, right? They're less central in your focus when you are attending to this exam. And my suggestion is that we should think of grieving, right, as a phenomenon that's best understood as a state of attention. So the various emotions or feelings, the various actions, behaviors, bodily states, etc., that I was mentioning a moment ago, all of these, I think, are manifestations of a temporally extended state of attention, where what we're doing is we are directing our attention at the deceased person who mattered to us and our relationship with them. So to kind of think about this, in terms of a kind of sequence of attention, right? So, prior to the death of someone who is important to you, maybe there's lots of different things that are operating within your consciousness, right? That are various foci of your consciousness. Among them is this person, right? I guess they're not deceased yet, they will be. But this person is among the things that you are directing your cognitive resources at. But during bereavement, what happens is that this particular fact or this particular reality, the fact that the person is now deceased, your relationship with them, occupies, if you will, the center of your attention, right? It sort of has this outsized place, and it pushes these other possible objects of attention more to the margins. But, right, my suggestion is that we should then think that grief ends, or bereavement ends, when our structure of our attention returns to the way it was previously, right? When it's no longer the case that the deceased or our relationship with them dominates our attention. And in fact, these other things, if you will, are equally significant, right, with respect to the focus of our consciousness. Now, this is important, I think, in thinking about the problem of resilience, because if we conclude, as I do, that grief is a state of attention, then notice that the onset of grief and the cessation of grief is not necessarily going to coincide with feelings of sadness. It may, in fact, begin before, right, the feelings of sadness, and in fact may persist afterward. So some of you may be familiar with the phenomenon that is sometimes called anticipatory grief. This is the grief that people seem to experience when they believe, right, that someone who matters to them is going to die in the near future, and they experience, if you will, grief in the anticipation of the death. Now, I would say that anticipatory grief marks the beginning of, again, attention, right, to this individual and to your relationship with them. And the beginning of that tension doesn't necessarily coincide with, if you will, bad feelings or sad feelings. Likewise, at the other end of grief, we shouldn't expect that the ending of sadness or the ending of sorrow means the end of grief. It may be that my sadness or sorrow abates, but I'm continuing to attend to my relationship with the deceased person in various sorts of ways. I may have other sorts of emotions toward them. I may be working through different aspects of my relationship with them. But the larger point I'm driving at here then is that the evidence that I was speaking of earlier about resilience, I think, misrepresents or may well misrepresent grief's duration. Individuals can and do continue to grieve, right, after they have seemingly adapted to the loss. And so grief only seems to end too soon, I think, if we just incorrectly identify grief with sad feelings. If, on the other hand, as I've argued, grief is a state of attention, then I don't think we can infer from this evidence that grief tends to end too soon for us. So I've argued just now that we should think not of grief not as a simple emotion or even a sequence of emotions, but as a state of attention that includes emotion, but includes a good bit else besides. Now, that's just the first of the four claims that I was meaning to vindicate, so let me turn to the other three. So what is it that makes the attention involved in grief rational? What is it that the attention is located toward or directed toward? And when is it that attention should no longer benefit us? When should grief end? Now, to understand the answers to these questions, we need a bit further of a foray into the nature of grief. So I think an important first observation about grief is that we don't grieve all deaths, nor I would say should we. Grief is a selective response to the deaths of others. And this raises, I think, a really central question: which deaths do we grieve and why? Now, throughout my work, I've defended the idea that we grieve those in whom we have invested what we should call our practical identities. So the notion of practical identity is a notion that I borrow from the philosopher Christine Korsgaard. She says that a practical identity is, broadly speaking, a kind of set of goals or commitments or concerns that are so central to your life that you would think of them as almost defining you, right? So a good many of the things that count as your goals or commitments or concerns are things where you would think of them as so intrinsically bound up with yourself and your own identity that it'd be perhaps even difficult to imagine yourself not caring about these things or not having these goals. And sometimes we actually cite our own practical identities as reasons for making the choices that we do or performing the actions that we do. We might say of some action that you're doing, I'm doing this because I'm her friend, or I'm doing this because I'm a member of a church, or I'm doing this because I'm a part of the scholarly community. Notice that those are indications, very roughly, of practical identity. Now, my account of grief says that we grieve those in whom our practical identity is invested, those in whom our practical identity has become very central. And notice that there are quite a large range of different kinds of people who are implicated in our practical identities. A good many of our goals, commitments, and so forth are only intelligible, right, by reference to other people. You cannot have goals or commitments and so forth related to friendship without having friends. You can't have goals, commitments, and so forth related to romantic partnerships without your partner. But of course, there's also other kinds of relationships in which we have invested our practical identities. So for example, public figures, celebrities perhaps, and even rivals. It's interesting to note that there are some very interesting case studies from the literature on grief wherein people grieve their rivals, right? Which you wouldn't expect ordinarily, but I think actually makes sense. After all, to think of someone as your rival is in some ways to think of them as giving you reasons to do certain kinds of things, to try to outdo them or out-achieve them. Now, because, right, grief arises in response to the deaths of those in whom we've invested our practical identity, it shouldn't surprise us then that so many people who are bereaved report that grief is experienced by them as a kind of disruption to their own sense of self, a kind of disruption to their own identity. So it's very common in grieving for people to feel a sense of alienation or disorientation, a kind of identity loss. They seem to experience grief as rooted in something like a kind of identity crisis. So the photo that you see here on the slide is a photo of C.S. Lewis. I imagine that many of you know C.S. Lewis from his books, The Chronicles of Narnia. But Lewis was a kind of philosopher in his own right. And in the early 1960s, he wrote and published a memoir describing his grief responses to the death of his wife, Joy Davidman. And he says quite literally, right, that his experience of grief was one in which he felt that he'd lost a part of himself, right, that he was in a certain way unrecognizable to himself. And furthermore, the world was unrecognizable to him. He described his relationship to the world around him as one where he felt separated from it by a kind of transparent blanket, as if there was a kind of invisible barrier between himself and the rest of the world. And he found himself often not at home in the world, not feeling at home in the world, even in familiar surroundings. He would walk through his house, visit his kitchen, go to the local market and so forth, and everything would feel sort of strange and alien during this period in which he was grieving the death of his wife. And this, I think, is a powerful, right, element of the grief experience. It seems like in grieving, we're trying, if you will, to figure out how to make our way in a world in which someone who had mattered to us in a certain sort of way, they were kind of anchor to our experience of the world, is no longer with us. I think one nice metaphor here is to think of grief as an attempt at practical remapping of the world, right? So you go through your life day to day with a certain person performing a certain kind of role in your existence. And they're kind of part of your practical map, right? They perform a certain kind of role in shaping what you do day to day. And if they die, they of course can't play that role anymore, right? It's a bit like trying to redraw a map of a place, but you have to take out perhaps a very prominent landmark. And what I think we're doing in grieving then is we are on the one hand oriented toward the past. We're concerned to try to make sense of what we have lost, but we're also at the same time trying to figure out what sort of practical identity we can have moving forward. So the thought is that grief in a way has kind of two temporal faces. Where on the one hand, again, looking toward the past, looking toward the relationship that we've lost, but also in various sorts of ways, trying to figure out how to incorporate the person whom we've lost into our life going forward. We can't relate to them in the way that we did before. It's just not possible for us to relate to a deceased friend or a deceased spouse or a deceased business colleague or a deceased artistic leader or artistic role model in the way that we did when those individuals were alive. And so as a consequence of this, we have to reorient our practical identity to take into account the fact of this person's death. The picture that I am offering you then of grief is quite similar to a picture propounded by a pair of researchers called Cholbi and Schutt in what they call the dual process model. So their thought is that in the course of grief, our everyday life experience is disrupted. And what we're doing is trying on the one hand to make sense of loss. In this way, we're looking toward the past. But at the same time, we're trying, as they say, to restore, right, a sense of everydayness, right, trying to restore a sense of ourselves. And so there's a way in which we oscillate, according to Cholbi and Schutt, between these two concerns or between these two tasks in the course of grieving. This is a picture that I think is quite consonant with my own philosophical account of the significance of grief. Okay. Now let's turn back then to resilience. Okay. So I think if we accept this picture that I've offered of what grief is and why it's significant to us, exactly what the nature of it is, then the question of whether our grief reactions are rational isn't the question of whether we should feel this or that emotion, whether we should feel sadness and so forth. But I think rather we should think of the rationality of grief based on whether or not we should devote or continue to devote attention to the deceased and our relationship with them. So the question that seems to be in the background of those who were propounding the problem of resilience is something like, should I continue to feel, or for how long should I continue to feel sad? That's not an irrelevant or an interesting question, but I don't think it's the focal question we should be asking when we think about the rationality of grief. We should instead be asking something like, should my attention continue? Is it rational for me to dedicate my attention to the deceased individual and our relationship with that individual? As far as whether or not or when grief should end, well, again, I think this question is well answered by the account of grief that I provided here. Once we've arrived at a satisfactory revised practical identity, right, a sense of ourselves that incorporates the fact of the person's death into our day-to-day concerns, we don't really have reason to devote attention to the deceased or to our relationship with them. There doesn't seem to be any further benefit to grieving once we have done this. And so, again, the question here is not whether we should continue to feel a certain feeling or certain emotion, but whether our attention should continue or abate. And then finally, I suggested that those who are impressed by the problem of resilience, in effect, believe, right, that grief is primarily oriented toward the past, to what we have lost. I don't disagree with that, but I think there's much more to it than that. It's also a chief way that is available to us of incorporating the loss into our future lives and values. So grief is not simply, right, a response to a loss, but it's also an attempt to figure out how to live with that loss as well. So it has a kind of future orientation that seems to me to be important when we think about the value of this apparent resilience. But what I hope to have convinced you of is that the idea that there is a problem of resilience, that we should be somehow unsettled by how short in many cases our grieving is, only makes sense if you make certain sorts of assumptions about grief and perhaps certain sorts of assumptions about resilience that I think we have good reasons not to make. And if we don't make those assumptions and can view grief in a different sort of light or according to a different sort of conception, then the problem of resilience strikes me as much less pressing. So again, that we recover from or are resilient in grief, I don't think is all that troubling. It doesn't seem to suggest to us that we are undervaluing our relationships. Perhaps we are, but I don't think that this evidence gives us reasons to think this. It doesn't suggest, for example, that grief typically or characteristically ends sooner than it ought to, that it ends too soon. Again, of course it could, right? Occasionally it will. But I think to find out whether someone's grief has ended too soon, we should look to whether or not the individual's attention has ebbed rather than to whether or not these negative emotions, such as sadness and so forth, have diminished. And as to the question of whether it should never end, right, this thought that grief responds to some fact that holds true in effect forever, and so it too should continue forever. Well, perhaps there are some really extreme instances of grief that should never end, but I think for the most part, they should end. When should they end? Well, I think they should end when the bereaved individual has come to incorporate the deceased into their practical identity and further attention to that relationship or to that individual is no longer warranted. So let me just conclude here with a few thoughts about what this might tell us about resilience. I've said a good bit about the nature of grief, so let me say something about resilience. I think one thing that this conversation shows is that when resilience is desirable, that doesn't mean that the resilient person returns to some earlier status quo. When resilience is a good thing, it is in effect a kind of adaptiveness. It shows an ability on our part to manage some change, not only a change in the world, but also of ourselves. I've in effect argued that when we grieve and grieve well, what results is that we are changed. And so resilience is not returning ourselves to a prior state, but if you will, altering ourselves in such a way that there is a good fit, right, between ourselves and our circumstances. I think a second lesson here is that resilience isn't always a matter of simply of what we feel. I've suggested that grief can be good for us and can be apparently resilient, even though, or despite, it's sometimes being the case that the feelings we might think of as the heart of grief, like say sadness or sorrow, may nevertheless abate before we expect them to. But that, I think, perhaps shows that resilience isn't to be measured simply in terms of what emotions a person undergoes. And then third, I think an important lesson we might take from this is that we should think that resilience is helpful not only for addressing contingencies, right, what might happen to us, but what almost certainly will. It's going to be the case that almost all of us will lose to death people who matter to us in the ways that I've suggested, people in whom our practical identities are invested. So the experience of loss is nearly inevitable in human life. So resilience isn't only useful for dealing, if you will, with sort of good or bad luck in a sense, but also for the kinds of features of human life that we should expect to encounter no matter who we happen to be. So with that, I will bring the conversation to a close. If you want to know more about the specifics of my grief research, I have a part of my personal webpage. You can see the URL on the bottom of the slide there, where you can poke around and learn more about some of my research. But thanks very much for listening, and I will be really happy to take your questions. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for giving that talk. I personally think that grief is, well, because as you said, it is something that everyone certainly is going to encounter in their life. I think it's a really important issue to kind of address and talk about, especially because we all have a philosophy of emotion, even if we don't put it in those terms, you know. So thank you for making the time to come meet with us and schedule this with us. I am going to turn it over to you all for questions. If you have any, feel free to think of them. I'll pass you the mic. But first, I'm just going to go ahead and ask, in your paper, you talk about the question of whether or not grief is self-centered, because a lot of the account that you've given makes grief more about the individual than the individual who has died. And I think that in a lot of ways that can feel uncomfortable. So I just wanted to hear what your thoughts are on that.
So I do think it's important, and I would say kind of undeniable, right, that we grieve because we ourselves experience loss, right? It's something that we do in response to things that matter to us, right? We again invest our identities in the lives of others. Many of our, sort of basic projects and goals and commitments, the things that are really vital and central to our lives, are things that matter to us. Now, I think that the idea that means that grief is in some way like selfish or egotistical, nevertheless can be resisted. So consider, right? One of the things that I think people often want to do in the course of grieving, particularly a close loved one, is to want to memorialize them, right? To have the world remember them, right? To make sure that other people know not only that they have died, but perhaps the significance or importance of their lives. And I think that it's an easy way to understand that from within the perspective of my views is that when these people matter to us, right, we want other people, right, to think that they matter, right? And we want the world, right, to take stock of the fact that this person is not in the sort of intersubjective space of the living, but is now dead. So that's just an example, I think, that illustrates the thought that while I think that there's a way in which grief is sort of egocentric, right? I mean, I think we do grieve for things that we ourselves lose. It doesn't mean that it is, if you will, sort of ego-focused, or that it means that we're sort of being vain or selfish or anything like that.
Absolutely, thank you. Do we have any questions this time? Yeah.
Sorry, when it comes to grief, can it possibly be amplified by the individual having an idea, maybe either it's something they observe or it's possibly something like maybe survivor's guilt, where either they feel like they could have prevented the person's death, or can it be amplified if there was absolutely nothing that they could do about it?
Good. So as I said, we tend, I suppose, to when we think about the affective, right, elements of grief, right, the emotional elements of it, to think first and foremost about, sadness, sorrow, and so forth. And that makes sense, right? I mean, almost all episodes of grief contain a good measure, right, of sadness and sorrow. But as I was mentioning earlier, of course, right, other emotion, right, another emotion that people can experience in the course of grief is guilt, right? That guilt can arise from any number of sources. I think you put your finger on one. Sometimes people feel guilty that they might have done more to prevent the person's death, or they perhaps feel guilty that they were not as helpful or generous or useful, right, to the person as they were dying, right? So I think there's a lot of different possibilities for why someone might experience guilt in the course of grief, but I don't think we should be too surprised by that, right? Again, on the theory that I'm propounding, it makes total sense, I'd say, right, that we feel a range of different emotions in the course of grief because the relationships that are leading us to grief are complex, right? There are all sorts of facts, right, that obtain, right, in our relationships with people who are now dead that influence, right, the emotions that we'll feel in the course of grief. So we'll feel, again, not only sadness and sorrow, not only what you're mentioning, guilt, but in some cases, anger or, anxiety, relief, any number of emotions. So again, I think to think of grief as kind of a phenomenon that reveals to us, if we didn't already know, right, characteristics of our relationships with the deceased, that's an important observation.
You identified at the beginning of your talk that philosophy of grief is sort of a field that you've had to swim upstream a little bit in to convince people that grief is something valuable and beneficial and good in some way, shape, or form. I just wanted to ask specifically about your identification of grief as attention in a contemporary, technologically focused world. Do you think that our, we talk a lot about the degeneration of our attention spans. Do you think that has in any way impacted society's understanding and attitude towards grief, our reliance on technology and distraction?
I would say that that's a question best addressed to a philosopher of technology rather than a mere philosopher of death like me. I think one thing that's very obvious, right, is that, various kinds of, digital technologies influence grief in quite a lot of ways, right? So just to give two quite obvious examples, one of the many new things, right, that we all encountered during the COVID pandemic, was the Zoom funeral, right? People, attending funerals remotely, right? Because people couldn't travel in person, right, to services, right, for their deceased loved ones and so forth. And I think that's, got its pros and cons, right? On the one hand, right, it seems to make it possible for people to maybe participate in rituals of mourning and grieving that they couldn't otherwise participate in. But on the other hand, of course, in the context of the pandemic, it meant that you couldn't be there in person. And I do think that there's something about the sort of physical proximity to other grieving people, and certainly for many people, physical proximity to the deceased body, to the corpse, that is maybe important to their grieving experience. So that's one example. Another one, and this really struck me, I think, about, well, I'm afraid I won't forget exactly when it happened, but I really noticed when the musician David Bowie died. I can't remember what year that was, if anybody happens to remember. I think it was about 2019 or somewhere in there. But I think what was quite fascinating about that is, if you looked about on social media, I think this is one of the first cases where social media was really, really integral, right, to how people grieved, right? People sharing, his music and, interviews and video clips and these kinds of things, right? So I think that was a powerful indicator to me that, like so much in our lives, right, grieving is, technologically mediated, digitally mediated. We don't just do it sort of, if you say, so to speak, in real life. We also do it, in the digital, right, sphere as well. So certainly, yeah, I mean, no doubt, technology has a role to play here. I sense in your question that maybe you're interested to some extent on to whether or not the problems maybe that digital life presents for attention might complicate grieving. Yeah, probably, right? But I don't think grieving is unique in that regard. To the extent that digital technology takes up too much of our attention, it probably takes up too much of our attention sometimes vis-a-vis grief. At least it seems to me conceivable that it can.
Yeah, thank you. Do you have a question with you? You want to pass something?
Hi, I have a question. My question is, do you believe that we can grieve someone who's still physically alive despite someone who's deceased?
Sure, because I think that our practical identities are invested in them not merely as alive, but also in many cases, we're invested in them in a particular form or guise, right? So I think the evidence suggests, for example, that people who have loved ones who suffer some sort of injury that puts that person in a permanent coma, right? The person is biologically or medically alive, right? Nevertheless, their loved ones do grieve them, right? They don't grieve their deaths in like a literal sense, but they grieve sort of the deaths of the person as they were, right? Because you obviously can't relate to someone in a coma in the same way that you can relate to, the person pre-coma. Likewise, another example that some of you may have encountered or maybe even have firsthand experience of, people often report that the experience of witnessing someone close to you undergo dementia, right? Sort of the decline that is involved, right? When people sort of slide slowly or quickly toward dementia, seems to have a grief-like quality to it because there's a sense that the person is being lost, right? They're not dead, of course, but the person that formed the basis of your relationship, right, is no longer present or is increasingly no longer present when they are moving toward dementia. So absolutely, right? Death is just, I suppose, a particularly emphatic, alteration to someone's identity, right? Such that we need to grieve their deaths, but of course we can grieve other transformations in them because those transformations also mean that our relationship with them is also transformed.
Thank you so much for your talk. I'm curious about the last point you were making around the concept that grieving should never end, but that it's rather logical that grieving ends when this practical identity is changed or transformed by death. So given that so many experiences where people are otherwise resilient following a death, but have these kind of small reoccurring events every year, right? Like the death anniversary or the person's birthday, a wedding anniversary, Christmas, right? Might be a reoccurring time when their attention returns, but otherwise throughout the year, you seem relatively resilient. I'm just wondering how you clarify this idea of like, well, your grief is kind of over, but in these small ways, it is forever lifelong.
Yeah, it's a very nice question. So one of the things I think, I'm inclined to say here is that I suppose we shouldn't ever think, right, that the alterations to our practical identity that we might undergo in the course of grieving, right, are, if you will, sort of etched in stone, right? That they're sort of, once they're there, they can never be altered, they can never be sort of revisited, right? I think you're pointing to, very commonplace examples of kind of triggers or stimuli that can kind of reopen grief and so on, death anniversaries and things like that. It's also, I think there are other really fascinating examples of this kind. One that I think is particularly interesting is, how many people who, upon becoming parents for the first time, if their own parents have died, they report a kind of grief moment, right? Sort of like, oh, gee, here I am becoming a parent, and that puts me in the mindset of thinking about, my own parents and my relationship to them. So I think the best answer is that, we reach sort of stasis or equilibrium, I think, in our relationships with the deceased. And sometimes those stases or equilibria can last for a very long time. But of course, sometimes those stases or equilibria can be disrupted, right, just by sort of the passage of time, recognition of like the anniversary of death or life events that kind of bring the deceased person back to our consciousness. So I tend to think, right, that we shouldn't ever think that the process of sort of altering our practical identity in light of this person's death is necessarily closed off permanently, right? Sort of sealed up in a box and you can never kind of revisit it. But of course, that also doesn't preclude, right? It's being the case that sometimes people die and we undergo grief and end of story. People don't revisit it sometimes, right? But kind of think of it in a more sort of provisional way, I guess, would be my thought.
I have another question. My question would be, what do you think makes grief unique upon other emotional responses to loss? So what makes grief unique?
Sorry, can you say what makes grief what?
What makes grief unique despite other emotional responses to loss?
Well, I mean, I think part of it is that grief bears a kind of intrinsic relationship to loss. We're grieving because of the loss, right? In the course of our, hour that we're together tonight, if it's a typical hour or so, something like 30 or 40,000 people will die in the world, right? I can have a reaction of a kind of emotional kind upon hearing that, a person died and so forth, but I'm not grieving their loss. Former Vice President Cheney died yesterday. I had a kind of emotional reaction to that loss, but it wasn't a grief reaction. It's a little hard to quite characterize what it is. So I think we have lots of different reactions, right, to people's deaths. And one of the things I think is maybe a little bit unfortunate is that I don't think we have a very large vocabulary to describe them, right? I think sometimes, it's mourning that we're doing, perhaps rather than grieving. Sometimes I think we're just sort of remembering or commemorating. I think sometimes we are what Beauvoir called inscribing, right? We're just sort of writing down or taking stock of the fact that someone has died, just sort of putting it in our, cognitive repertoire that someone is not in this world that we share anymore. So I think what makes it unique, right, is again the fact that we grieve the deaths of those in whom our practical identities are invested, and that's why we experience grief in the way that we do, right? The sort of the particular features it has, right, are owed to that particular fact. But other, emotional responses to death are, of course, possible, and we do undergo them. I think it'd be interesting for someone to try to, develop a kind of taxonomy of these kinds of responses, right? The responses that aren't grief, right? Because they do seem to me to be various and subtle.
Thank you. I'm sorry, by the way, if you've answered this already. I'm kind of just coming into this. I had a class before, but this whole discourse is really interesting to me. Actually, it's kind of adding on a question that was asked before about like sort of what it means to like grieve somebody that's still present. I think I'm not sure if you've experienced that yourself in any sense, but like I've had a couple of people in my life like recently as well, where I feel like they have sort of had this like transformation, becoming an entirely different person that I don't really know anymore. And I'm kind of wondering, like, is there anything, I guess, in your experience or that you can think of that's like a good way to cope with that? Because I think this one thing that I'm sort of doing is like almost relearning this person, is like meeting them as a new person. But that's kind of hard because you're still like, you know, grieving this loss of somebody else that you knew before. So like, is there anything that you would recommend in terms of like handling that?
So I always like to remind people I'm a mere philosopher. I'm definitely no therapist or counselor of any kind. I'd have to bill you a few $100s just, you know, for a short answer to your question. I mean, I think one thing that your question puts its finger on is that the account that I give of grief, which is really an account of bereavement, as scholars would say, right? It's an account of the grief we undergo in response to others' death, you know, generalizes to other kinds of alterations in our relationships with others, right? So the question that was asked earlier about, grieving, right, in the expectation of someone's death, or grieving someone who's gone into a coma, or who, you know, is undergoing dementia. And all of those are cases where our relationship with them is disrupted because our relationship with them was predicated upon them being a certain way, right? And when they're not, right, or when it appears that they soon won't be, then grief seems to be in order. But I'm happy to think that grief is responsive to, or can be responsive to, all kinds of transformations in our relationships with others. It's been suggested to me that my views could be helpful in thinking about certain of our emotional responses to romantic breakups, right, or divorce, right, things like that, right, which I think that's plausible. As far as what to do about it, I don't know. I think, you know, the sort of key message, right, that I suppose I've tried to broadcast about grief for quite a few years now is just that it's not something that we should look down upon or think that it is somehow a betrayal of some sort of infirmity or weakness or lack, right, in us as human beings, right? It is in fact a quite impressive and formidable thing that we do when we grieve, right, alterations in our relationships with others, and we should in that sense be glad for it. So I don't have really specific advice for you other than maybe lean into it, right? That rather than thinking that it's something to be avoided or tamped down, that it's something that, to the extent that you can, embrace it.
Hi, so I think it's really clear that basically people have very complex individual relationships with like their loved ones, and that naturally kind of spawns like complex individual processes of grief. But you do talk about like the stages of grief theory, the Kubler-Ross theory, I believe. And I'm just kind of wondering, like, do you think that this is kind of like because I've personally seen like a lot of people attribute the grieving process to this. Do you think that's kind of just like a learned shortcut? Like it's kind of something that's influenced by like media and like just kind of like the outness of that? Or is it just kind of like a retroactive like retelling of someone's like grief process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think people need, right, psychological, intellectual, mental frameworks for thinking about grief, right? You know, I mentioned in my talk that I think one of the things about grief that is perhaps most interesting to me is this way in which it feels like a very kind of disorienting experience, like you don't really know what to do, right? You feel a little bit lost and alienated from yourself and so on. And so it's very natural then, I think, that people will want, you know, sort of guardrails, right, or you know, frameworks, right, for processing and understanding their own experience, right? Kubler-Ross's 5-stage model, I think, came in at a very propitious cultural moment, right? Late 1960s, early 1970s, when there really hadn't been a lot of conversation in the United States and in the English-speaking world about grief. I think a few people are helped by it, but I think what we've discovered over time is that the Kubler-Ross model is false, right? In the sense that there's a few people, right, who go through denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance in that order and so forth, but overwhelmingly people don't, right? They don't go through all 5 of those stages, or if they go through all 5, they go through them in a different order, or they go through some other experiences that might be thought of as additional stages and so forth. And so I think that, you know, this is a claim that has been tested empirically, right, by grief researchers, and it just doesn't really hold water, right? As a sort of model for most people's grieving. This doesn't mean it's not, useful for some people, right? Or, that you should think that, I don't know, it's completely misguided. But I would say that it would not be my first port of call, right, to try to understand, your grief experience. I suppose the most obvious shortcoming in it that's been found in the research is that most of us don't engage in denial, right? And that's supposed to be the first stage, right? We start to grieve not by engaging in denial, but we're grieving because we know the person is dead, right? Which is the opposite of denial, right? So, yeah. Anyway. But it has had a lot of influence for sure.
To what extent does knowledge of, say, loss play into the grieving process? Say, like someone has lost someone and without mental knowledge, but they have a strict and prolonged physical reaction. Could that be called grief in the same way?
Help me understand the question a little bit better. So they don't actually know that the person has died, but
Either that or they forget based on some, say, memoration.
like amnesia, something like that.
Sure.
Like,
Yeah, Alzheimer's.
Why the same traumas carried in the body, even if you aren't cognitively aware, for whatever reason. Anyways.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, yeah. Well, as I said, I think we should not be the slightest bit surprised, right, that grief tends to have a bodily register to it, right? That, part of what goes on in grief is that our bodies respond, right? That would be really quite surprising if they didn't. But I'm not aware of any evidence that suggests that people will have this kind of physiological response without the underlying cognitive bases, right? That is to say, sort of the belief that the person is either dead or near dead, or approaching death, or perhaps they're envisioning or imagining a person's death. I mean, one thing I think is definitely possible is that we can get ourselves right into a condition that is, resembles grief by imagining the death of someone who is important to us. Yeah.
Maybe to follow up on that a little bit, in psychology, we have this concept of ambiguous loss. So people whose family members are prisoners of war or kidnapping victims or have run away. In that way, maybe you suspect the person is dead, or there's a chance that person is dead, but you don't have that same psychological closure, like the definitive knowledge. So maybe to that point, like, being in that in the middle phase of like, maybe they're dead, but maybe I should hold out hope. How does that impact a person's grief?
Right. I absolutely agree with you that, ambiguous loss is a genuine phenomenon, right? And I suppose, there's some intricacy here as to whether or not we want to describe that as grief exactly, right? It sort of seems to me that maybe it's got a little bit of the psychological characteristics of grief, maybe some of the emotional dimensions of it. But I do think it's a kind of hardship, right, to feel that perhaps you have lost, your loss is ambiguous, or simply not knowing, right, whether some loss has in fact transpired. So in some other work that I'm doing, articulating the idea that there's a human right to grieve, I make use of examples having to do with the repatriation of remains of combatants, right? So one of the things that seems to cause a lot of families of those who are killed in combat, a lot of distress, right, is sort of not knowing exactly whether they're dead, or, what the circumstances of their death were, or, all these kinds of things. So I absolutely think that's a real phenomenon. And I think it's likely to have, a good bit of overlap, right, with grief in any case, yeah.
Thank you, Michael. I know we got just a couple minutes left here. I wanted to take this question in a little bit different direction, and that has to do with in terms of political philosophy or political grief or community grief. And I guess the question would be, if you have considered some of these things, what are some distinct elements of how a community grieves? And I'm thinking, I'll give you 3 examples. One would be survivors of the Holocaust that say we should never forget, right? There's this kind of duty to remember. And that is not exactly the same thing as grief, but you know, some of it is that. I think if I was at this February, I did a civil rights journey down to the South and went to the lynching memorial. One of the memorials that is to remember the treatment of African Americans, and in particular, even just that act of that. And then I think about how some political commentators say that some of the, say, support for, I don't know, certain conservative politics is white grief over the loss of some nostalgic time that they thought was there. So I'm just wondering, I know they're just examples, but how grief works out politically. and if there's a kind of parallel to some of these categories that you're saying. I think there's a parallel in terms of identity, but that, so.
Well, I'm glad we can end on an easy question. So it's something I'd like to be able to say something more exact and substantial about, but I'm trying to work my way toward it. But I certainly think a lot of the resources that I develop in my work in thinking about grief sort of, you know, at the personal level could be illuminating, right? In thinking about grieving when we're doing it with other people, jointly or collectively. And I certainly think you're right to suppose, or I suspect you're right to suppose, that the notion of practical identity could be helpful in thinking about that, right? Sort of understanding how it is that communities grieve together. I think there's sort of interesting complications here, because I think sometimes the sense that let's say the death of, I don't know, a certain figure within a particular socioethnic group. For example, Emmett Till comes to mind as an interesting example here, the boy who was, you know, lynched and killed in the South, right, back in the 50s. I think very often, right, that grieving together creates shared practical identity rather than sort of presupposing it, right, that, you know, it's sort of more like a product, right, of people grieving together rather than a presupposition of it, which I think is very interesting. But I'll just say I don't have like a well worked out theory of any of the phenomena you're talking about, other than to say that I'd like to think that I've got some things in my philosophical toolkit that can help us make sense of it. I'm working with a philosopher at University College London right now on the question of sort of how it is that mortality in general could be a source of solidarity, right? Political solidarity amongst people. And one kind of aspect of that is how grieving together, right, could be a source of political solidarity. How does that happen? Why doesn't it happen in some circumstances, and why does it happen in others? We're talking in our work a good bit about the sort of phenomenon of you know, AIDS grief in the 1980s, right? You know, the AIDS quilt and these kinds of phenomena. So I'm definitely very interested in this. I don't have like a really, as I say, well worked out account of it, but I'd like to think I've got maybe some good starting points.
Yeah. Okay, so I think we're just about out of time. So I just wanted to, again, thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for scheduling with us. I just wondered if there's any final takeaway, because obviously this is something you sort of dedicated your whole life's research to. So if there's like one thing that you would have us think about, or like a book to recommend, or how can we carry this into?
Well, I mean, I think I appreciate the thought. I mean, I guess what I would say is I think that one thing that philosophy can do for us is equip us with knowledge that doesn't solve our problems, but maybe it makes them seem less daunting, right? And I think, you know, grief is a kind of complicated human problem. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. And I guess one of the things that's motivated my own work is that if I can give people a richer philosophical understanding of grief, then perhaps we have less reason to fear it more. We'll be more open to embracing it, rather than, you know, as those philosophers I was mentioning in the presentation did, sort of thinking of it as worrying or threatening, or as something that speaks to sort of unfortunate limitations that we have as human beings.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us remotely. Hopefully some point you get to Chicago, so feel free to stop by North Park anytime.
I will.
Yeah, and thanks to the rest of you for all coming to the event, and of course, Alana in particular for leading us through this discussion. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Take care, man.